Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Well, it's very nice to see so many people here for a history and culture talk. We've got a lot of people online, so it's going to be recorded as well, this talk. I'm very pleased to introduce Deepali Gaskell. She's a long-term member here, and she's given several talks here before. One was on the development of growing tea in India, which was a very interesting talk, which also had a demonstration of how to make tea properly. And the other talk was on the zero, the development of zero, how zero was, what was it called?
The
origin of zero. But tonight she's going to talk about a subject that is close to her heart. Her mother was a Sanskrit scholar, and she knows a lot about Sanskrit. And so please join me in welcoming Deepali Gaskell.
Thank you. It's quite a vast subject, but I've tried to bring it into focus on the number of slides that I've got here. So I hope I'm going to make sense. But anyway, bear with me if I'm going into too many details. So I'm going to start really with my voyage of discovery. Unlike what Marie-Louise just said, I didn't start out knowing a lot about Sanskrit, and I discovered it as I grew. So my talk today is about the Sanskrit language, which is now a dead and formal language like Latin and Greek, and not spoken. The language developed out of the need of the ancient settlers on the Himalayan mountain range to record the observations they made from the heights of these mountains, and to convey these observations and their thoughts in an accurate way. The language, therefore, needed to reflect this, be precise and exact, and therefore needed to have a range of sounds to encompass subtle nuances that would otherwise be missed. Although the origin of this language goes back several thousand years, its sounds can still be heard in the languages that are spoken today, as we shall see, through my journey of exploration. Okay, thanks. My personal journey. My journey looks at what these ancestors who invented the language were doing and thinking and wanting to communicate, an interesting voyage. And I call this a voyage because while I was born in India, the land of Sanskrit, and I'm the daughter of a mother who was a Sanskrit scholar, I spent a large part of my childhood abroad with my parents. And on returning to India, my education continued in English. And my encounter with the Sanskrit language came much later when I came across translations of the Vedas from Sanskrit into English in this country that had been commissioned by the East India Company in the mid-18th century as they were trying to get more established in Bengal, the home of my forefathers. So I'm going to talk about the sounds that I heard as a child. As a child, while traveling around the world with my parents, I had recognized the similarity in sounds for commonly used words in the languages that I heard then, and the differences with some of the others. I had learned Spanish from our Spanish nanny when in Central America, and some Italian, and later studied French at school. I found that everyday words in these languages all had the same sounds. For example, ma, pa, bra, and of course, in the numbers, which I shan't recite at this moment. I joined a German conversation group after school, and again, no was 9, similar to Hindi again, na, nahi. One of my friends at school, while we were abroad, was from Israel. I noticed when I heard her talking to her mother that these same words in the languages mentioned started with different consonants in Hebrew, e.g., no was lo, which in Spanish and Italian and French was similar to Hindi and Bengali, no, na. Much later, when living in Dubai, I was not too surprised that no in Arabic was la, similar to the neighboring Hebrew lo. And everyday nouns in both these languages started with a vowel sound rather than the consonant, as in Hindi, Spanish, etc. For example, ma, pa, bra were amma, abba, So in the opposite, they had a similarity. This is when I noticed the geographical connection. So I will digress for a slight on one or two slides, and I'll talk about the Sanskrit sounds that are heard in everyday languages today. So typical sounds that were used for immediate needs and observations by the settlers on the Himalayas that we use today are, I shall go quickly through it, and the translations are on the slide if you wanted to look at them. Mata, Pita, Bhrata, Shweshta, Duhita, Santan. Mother, father, brother, sister, daughter, son. Sar, Nak, Mukh, Okki, eyes, Galadha, gullet, Chati, chest, Hasta, Pada, hand and feet. And just as a small digression, other connections are there as well. For example, Zen in Japanese is from Dhyan, which is meditation. And the Jiva, Chitta in Sanskrit, which is to do with soul and spirit, has been adopted in Chinese as Chi or Ki. I'm not sure how they pronounce it there. So I shall quickly go through how languages originated. I will start with a quick look at this, and it would have been from sounds that were made by early humans for communicating immediate and basic needs. This meant having words for these essentials, parts of the body, things to eat, things that were immediately observed and encountered. A natural question that arose for me was why these sounds for the same words were similar for certain groups and different for others, and that the groups had a geographic connection. So I will trace the origin of the Sanskrit language and then come to Sanskrit in the modern world. So I'm going back to Sanskrit, and I will talk about the geographical connections later. My journey will take you through what I came across in more recent times when I encountered translation of the Vedas in this country, composed in Sanskrit in ancient times. As I had found when growing up, sorry, am I being heard or am I a bit muffled? Okay, farther away. Is this a bit better? Is this clearer? Sorry. Is this better? Okay. As I had found when growing up, the words for these basics in English sound like the words for the same in languages spoken in northern India, but different to what I heard spoken by people from other parts of India. For example, the Tamil ille is similar to the lo and la of the Arabic and the Hebrew. And I'd also lived in Burma as a child, and there as well, sounds were different. So in answer to the question, are the words used for things the same for all the languages? And the answer is clearly no. I'm going to quickly take you through some other words in everyday use from Sanskrit, because it will be interesting. So door from dwar, supine from supta, navel from nabhi, day from divas, same from sama, self from swa, path from pat, name from nam, roadway from rasta. And what's important to us in my talk today is dharati, which is earth, but it comes from dharan or dharana, which is similar to the word adhere, because that will take me to why the language Sanskrit was invented, because we are actually on the planet Earth because of this force of gravity, so adhere. And vidya, which is knowledge or insight, which is similar to the Italian vedere, gnan, which is knowledge, konossos, knowledge and cognition. Vignan or vigyan is science. Again, it's a combination of V, which is insight, and gnan, which is knowledge. Deva, which is deity. Shaitan, which is Satan. Gana, Gita, Gayati, which in Italian and other European languages are canto, shante, cantare. And shloka, which is slogan. There's another list of words which will be on the slide, so I won't go through them all, but I just want to repeat the words that will be very relevant to the rest of the talk. So that is direction, which is digha, disha, dik, base, which is basa, posterior and past, which is picha and paschit, behavior, treatment is vyavaha, and of course, adhere, which is dharan. I've also listed out the numbers, which in Sanskrit are ekang, divi, trini, chatvari or chatva, panchva, shat, sapta, ashta, nava, dasha, which are very similar to the languages in Europe. 1, 2, 3, 4, katra, quattro, whatever, penta in Greek, and 6, which is shat, is shwesh, I don't know how you pronounce it in Welsh, se in Irish, sapta is septus, and siv in Norwegian, achta is octo in, well, it's in one, I think it's Latin, and acht in German, 9 is nava, dasa is 10, which is dis. So before I talk about the geographical connection, I want to go to the origin of language belts, migration and settlements. So the Himalayan region is where the structured Sanskrit language was invented by my ancestors who settled there, and it related to their lifestyle. This region, as you may know, is a land of mountains and high valleys, a higher and more extended version of the Alps, if you like, where the horizon stretches out and visibility of the firmament is very clear. Hence, I believe the term Kashmir is from the Sanskrit akash for sky, and mir possibly from amar, meaning eternal or endless. So why did these people settle here? And before going into great depth about that, all I can refer to is this map, which I have put on the slide, where you see the 2 arrows. This one here, okay. So can I be heard? Yeah. So the North Pole is currently there. And in recent times, planetary precession or the shift in the axial tilt was measured and seen to have a periodicity of every 70,000 years. What happens is the axis, the Earth's axis, tilts 15 degrees, and this happens every 70 to 100,000 years. When that happens, so when the axial tilt brought the North Pole into the middle of Siberia, what was happening is that the climate change became very severe, because water dissipates, water behaves differently to Earth. So when the North Pole, the coldest bit, came to the middle of Siberia, this whole region, which is land, became uninhabitable because of the cold weather. And what happened was people started to migrate outwards. I've got some arrows here. And they moved in radially in different directions. And interestingly, the sound similarities in sounds that I detected as a child had a geographical connection. So the Sanskritic sounds were all similar along this greenish belt, which of course is along the northern Indian belt, which is the Himalayan region and the foothills, and going sideways through Greece, Italy, where I made these connections with the similarity in sounds with Greek, Italian, and the Latin languages, all the way up to Norway, Old Norse. And the Aramaic sounds that I found similarities with the Lola and Amaba, what started from Hebrew and Arab and had connections with Southern Indian Tamil languages and petered off there. And then in the reverse order, the languages that are along the blue lines have similar connections with Icelandic, Finnish, perhaps Northern Siberian. I haven't actually made a study of that. And down the spine of North and South America. So these people clearly, culturally, took with them their cultural sounds. And so the sounds used in those languages are similar, and the sounds used in these languages are similar, and as in the Aramaic belt. The red belt is something that I'm not familiar with at all. So moving on. Oops, sorry. So moving on, the words in used, okay, so clearly there was this migration away from, sorry, I'll need that again, thanks. Can we go back to the previous slide? Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I've called this slide settlements and resettlements, because if we study the languages, the root words take us to the beginnings of language because they relate to issues that were immediate and close, like, you know, parts of the body and immediate needs. But when we look at language that has developed further with needs that are farther away, you know, as evolution took place, those words would be quite different. So when we look at some languages, such as Slavic languages and Hungarian and others, they live in that area, they inhabit that area, but their languages are different, which is because of the resettlement. So all the people who migrated away were pastoral people, and a lot of them maintained that pastoral life, nomadic life. And when it became habitable again, when the axial tilt went back to, when the North Pole went back to where it is today, and people began to re-inhabit that region, they had a different language, but the similarities go back to when they had contact before, and also the groups exchanged words. So, sorry. So on to the next slide, and I'll just elaborate on, sorry. Is this better? So I'm going to elaborate on the words in use in these different regions like Turkey, Hungary, Armenia, perhaps Finland, where the sounds are different. And the Aramaic belt, of course, I've talked about. And the blue bit, may I just borrow that again, thanks. So this blue region that I've shown here is, and this one is the Sanskritic belt, or what is known as the Indo-Aryan Indo-European languages. And the orange belt has similarities with Tamil, which is the southern part of India. So yeah, I'll just quickly digress on why it's also called the Aryan belt, because that's the name that was invented. That term was invented sort of in the late 18th, 19th century, late 18th and early 19th century, when after the translations were made that will talk about, brought to the knowledge of the Westerners the term Arya, which was used for speakers of the Sanskrit language. So going back to the beginnings of Sanskrit, the words that were used by settlers were formalized into a structured form of communication arising from the need to formally record the observations that were being made and to pass on their learning to future generations. This was done by recording insights gained by the people in rhyming couplets that they composed for ease of repetition and memorizing. By definition, the term Sanskrit or Samaskrita was given to the language created to measure the origin of existence, and is from sama or same, or that which is, and krita, which is actions, culture, activity, practice, custom. And so it was a language that fitted the activity that these ancestors were engaged in, which is observing the heavens. A similar language developed south of the foothills of the Himalayan range when these Himalayan people started to move into the foothills of the rest of India a few millennia later, and that language was known as Prakrit, a derivation of Sanskrit that incorporated sounds already in use by indigenous inhabitants. It is from pra, as in prachin, meaning ancient or original, or pre, and krita, which I said is culture or activity. So Sanskrit was created by my ancestors who were basically observers, astronomers, and philosophers, to record their observations of the astral bodies and their understanding of the nature of the universe as being energy which condensed into matter. I'll come to how they arrived at that deduction. They deduced that all forms of matter on our own planet Earth and on all the other heavenly bodies were held onto the surface by this force of gravity, and hence the term dharati for our planet Earth, which is derived from the word dharana, to hold or adhere, as is the word used today. So Himalaya, the abode of snow, is where the ancestors settled in the belt that goes from the modern-day Kashmir eastwards to the border with Yunnan region in China. This is where they could live and be observing the heavens and pursuing their quests. But I want to make very clear that the range drops very suddenly at the end, where it ends and the Yunnan Valley begins. And there's a very clear distinction in the culture of the peoples that are in the Yunnan region, because their sounds are completely different. Understanding the source of the perceptible universe. So what these ancestors were doing and needing was to understand the source of the visible universe. They were observing the world around them, the skies, and asking the questions, and the skies, the vegetation, terrain, and each other, and asking the questions: why are we here? What are we seeing? What are they made of? And what are we made of? So the language needed to record their observations, noting their observations and interpreting these observations. So Sanskrit has, as I have said, moved on from the immediate needs to do with natural urges, eating, sleeping, and immediate perceptions, to the need to express the wonder and the questioning. And the deductions that were made laid the foundation for more and that brings us to what is known today as physics, chemistry, evolution of the natural world and living species, and biological sciences. So the key to conveying the exact meaning of the philosopher's observation was precision and rules to ensure precise connotations with each of the sounds and their combinations. So phonology became a very important thing. I will come back to the importance of sound and chanting. Initially, these insights gained by the philosophers were recorded, as I said before, in rhyming couplets. Sound came later. So script came later, sorry. So I will go into the sounds first. Yeah, what's on the screen is the written alphabet, which came later, but they embody the sounds that were created to convey the exact meaning. So there were 16 vowel sounds, each resonating with parts of the spine, therapeutic value in chanting, using all parts of the mouth ending in a hum with the lips coming together. So I've represented the alphabets there on, can we go back to the previous slide, please? Yeah, so I've represented the sounds, the consonant sounds in the middle column. So it, so it covers all the parts of the mouth. Liquids, really, with the tongue rolled back in the mouth, and with the back of the tongue. So you're encompassing all the sounds that could be made without actually touching bits of the parts of the mouth. Then we come to the consonants, where you start with the gullet, galada, cha, then you move to the tongue, cha cha ja cha ya, da ta da da, you're moving forward with the tongue, ta ta da da na, then you move to the lips, pa pa ba ba ma, and then you go back to the really, ya lava, and they're called, what are they called? Sorry, glides, sonorants. So that was the, those were the classes of different sounds that were made to when they're chanting. So all the sounds are covered and the meanings are very precise. So the people who were doing the chanting couldn't swap sounds, couldn't swap sounds, because as soon as they did that, the meaning would be altered. So back to the quests into the very essence of matter. These dedicated observers were essentially the earliest philosophers, delving into the wonder of what they saw and asking the questions: why are we here, what are we made of, etc. Their observations of the heavens led to not just reflecting on the nature of existence, but to seeking to relate these and perceptions of these into the very essence of what existence is, matter as being energy. So that brings me to the need to measure time. So the philosophers came to an understanding from their observations over a century of the behavior of astral bodies and of the nature of matter, that it formed over time, starting from the smallest entity, which was the essence of all that was visible and perceptible, being brought together to form what was perceptible, essentially existence. And these particles were being brought together by a force they called Shakti. As it was deduced that existence was a function of time, which was what related the movements in these heavens that were observed to the reality that was perceived, there was a need to measure these movements, and this gave rise to the invention of numbers. So the number system was invented, numerals represented. The system of measurement, I'm just quoting very briefly from the earlier talk, which I had given on the origin of the zero, using 10 fingers, the digits, with numbers 1 to 9 being assigned to the first 9 digits. And for the 10th digit, the shunya, or the zero, was used, denoted by a space within a circle, to be used with the number 1 to indicate the end of the first and the beginning of the next series of 10 numbers, which actually gave rise to the placeholder 0 together with 1, thereby creating an infinite number of binary options, and also the basis for measuring time in what's of tens? Powers of 10, which allowed them to measure over several millennia, during which these recordings, observations were being recorded of the movements of the astral bodies and the time that it took. So time measurement became very important. The concept of the zero was not developed by other cultures, nor was the zero used as a number or in any calculations by these other cultures, as may have been conjectured. There's also evidence that Pythagoras visited India in the 3rd century BC, where he came across the principles of geometry being used by astronomers there. So that brings me to the Sanskrit script and the concept of the zero and matter from energy. Concept of the zero, that all observable matter, when broken down into its smallest entity, would ultimately approach a state of there being a core, which was again a particle which had within it a space and a focal point. And that core would be a space within a circle within that, its own core, until it would approach an ultimate core, which would be an empty space. And that was shunya, or nothing, which is the force or energy that holds everything in place. This concept was therefore denoted by the circle, which I talked about, a space within a boundary. Matter and energy. This was born out of the observations over several millennia of the cyclical behavior of the astral bodies that brought into focus that there would be a core or center to each of these cycles or paths, which would be a force that caused these cyclical movements in the heavens, and that this replicated how all matter must behave. It's a bit of a repetition, sorry, but I'm just trying to build up my story. So the all observable matter, when broken down, had a core, which was simply empty. which was simply energy. The perceptible reality was understood to be coming together over time. Forgive me for the repetition. Am I in the right place? Yeah. And the deductions that at the start of existence was a force, which is denoted by the zero, which was just energy, which is why it's zero, nothing, because there was no perceptible matter, nothing that you could put your hand on, or it was just simply energy, and therefore it was called Shunya. And it was called, it's embodied by Brahma, the creator. These visual or conceptual depictions arose from the need the philosophers had to make their concepts understandable by the people at large, because people at large found it difficult to relate to abstract concepts, and therefore these depictions came into being. And Brahma was what depicted the source or the creator. To be able to measure time, the time that it took to form perceptible existence, a system of counting was needed and was invented, and therefore the numbers 10, the 10 digits, and the Sanskrit thus means 10, mal is time, so the decimal system, modern decimal system, is from the dasmal. And the philosophers use their understanding of existence as originating from the Shunya, repetition again. So let me move on, and I'm just going to mention a few words here that relate to time and the spatial context. Purva, which is first, before, is east. Paschim, which is after and following, is west. Uttar, above, is north, and Dakshin, base, is south. So coming to energy, matter, astrology, and the concept of evolution. The study of astrology, very interesting, because the study of astrology developed over an extensive period of time through these observations made of living creatures and their behavior. Sorry, am I too close to the mic? Okay. And the evolving pattern of their development. This was seen in relation to the interaction of energy in its different forms, including matter in life forms. The stages of evolution were represented later by the poets Valmiki and Vyasa, roughly in the 6th millennium BC and in the 3rd millennium BC. Sorry, my mistake. 3rd millennium BC and 1500 BC in the epics Ramayana and Mahabharata in the forms that the lay people would relate to. So evolution was represented in the form of 10 incarnations or forms depicting the avatars of Vishnu, the preserver. So the concept of creation was the embodiment of this Shunya, the basic energy from which we all came, was Brahma, the creator, and Vishnu was the preserver who kept the existence going. And he was represented as the 10 avatars, Dash Avarata. And in the epics that were created to relate the philosophy to the people through these epic poems, which were then enacted in play form around the country in villages. So the concept was created and heroes were created. So I'm going to talk about the 10 avatars of Vishnu, which were created to depict the concept of evolution. So the first, on the left-hand side are the 5 avatars of Vishnu, pre-human existence. So evolution started with Matsya, the fish, Paleozoic era, which is an aquatic creature. Matsya is fish. Then the next form of Vishnu is Kurma, which is Kachava, or Kachava, which is an amphibious tortoise, Mesozoic period, an amphibian creature. So the creature starts to move to earth, followed by an earth creature, Varaha, or boar, followed by Nara Simha. Nara is man, Simha is lion, man-lion, half man, half lion, or hunter-gatherer. Then came Vamana, a dwarf, the first step towards human form. On the right, the next 5 avatars are Parasurama, so hero but imperfect human form, wild early human, followed by Rama, the hero king, befriended by Hanuman, Hanuman being the king of the monkeys which inhabited the southern part of India, and his search for his abducted wife Sita, the perfect human with divine qualities. This was followed by Krishna, who was represented in the epic created in the 1500 BC as son of Devaki, and he was a mentor to Arjuna, sage and mentor. I'll just digress very slightly into the story of Mahabharata, which is sort of an evolved form of society where Maha is great, Bharat is the country India. War took place between cousins, first cousins, and the Kurus were the cousins who inhabited the western half of India because their mother was, there were 100 sons of Kuru, and their mother was Gandhari, Gandhar is the Sanskrit word for what is now Greece. So, and that was their estates. And Kuru's brother was Pandav, and he had only 5 sons, and his sons were sort of, you know, in what is known as, what's the eastern regions of India now. When the Kauravas, the sons of Kuru, were disputing the land with their brother, the Pandavas, they then amassed huge armies and were sort of on the field in what is now Delhi, on either side of the field. And Arjuna, the son of the Pandavas, one of the Pandavas, got nervous and said, "Look, I can't kill those people. They're my cousins. I can't kill them." And Krishna, who was the charioteer, said, "You're not going to kill them. They're dead already, because I killed them a long time ago, and you're here because you're standing up for your values. So you can't just not do what you've come here for. You have to do it because you're not killing them. I've already killed them." So which brings us to the concept, basically, of what is existence and what is perceptible existence, because it's there and not there at the same time, because at the basis of everything is we are all forms of energy. So next slide, astrology, astronomy, human behavior, energy, and matter. The study of astrology followed the understanding of evolution and is the beginning of the formalization of astronomy. The importance of the astrological chart was to help the newborn in life to be aware of the influences on his or her cerebral functions and decision-making through life, and consequently to his or her behavior, and therefore to help him or her lead a more productive life. It was understood that at the time of birth, the brain of the child would be exposed to the different energy frequencies from different astral bodies configured at the exact moment of birth, which would leave a pattern on the newly born infant's brain, which would in turn determine the activity of the brain over the course of the newborn's life. Hence the importance of gauging the exact positions of all matter and energy in the universe, the astral bodies that emanated this energy. This was key to having a system with which to measure the movements of these astral bodies and their exact positions at any time. So astrology, astronomy, and numbers, energy, matter, and evolution. Astrology, therefore, played a key role in giving rise to the need to understand the exact configuration of the heavens at any point in time that influenced human behavior. This required a deep understanding of the movements of galaxies in space. And their understanding was, of course, recorded in Sanskrit through the configuration of all the vowel and sounds and the consonant sounds in what are known as the Vedas. The Vedas basically were scripted in 6000 BC when the script was invented. But until that time, as I explained, the sounds were created and they recorded the observations of the heavens and the numbers, which I talked about, the billions of years, and they came to the conclusion that the universe didn't have a central origin or core. It's not geocentric. It's not even solar-centric. The center of the universe is not a single center. And that each of the astral bodies that we observed had their own core, because when these observers were observing the movements of the heavenly bodies, they realized that they all had a different center. And the whole concept of all of this was embodied, as I explained, in depictions that would make sense to non-philosophers. And so this is a representation of Vishnu, who's the preserver. So Brahma was the creator, Vishnu is the preserver. And if you can look, can I have the point, please? Thanks. So I'm going to show you. So in his right hand, the index finger is holding the spindle. The finger is the spindle, and the spinning disc represents the galaxies, or basically creation and existence. And on his left hand, he's holding a conch shell. Now, conch shell in India is blown to create a sound, boom, which is actually similar to the sound, which is all our vowels, and each element of the vowel resonates with a part of the sound. So it's, as I said, it was therapeutic. So basically, he's representing the preservation of the universe, creation of the physical universe. And what's happening in the world of physics today is that they're exploring the concepts that are in the Vedas about the existence. And through, these are pictures taken by Hubble, followed by, what's this new one? Webb telescope. This is the latest picture sent by the Webb telescope of the galaxy. And that's exactly what's represented by the spindle there, which is spinning, and there's a core, which is pulling everything to the center, so that it's essentially a black hole, but a black hole isn't a hole. It is what the gravity is pulling the energy into, and then when it becomes, when the energy is quite a lot of energy, it then spews out in a vertical manner. So it's basically representing what Vishnu is holding on his forefinger. And the whole concept of the universe as being circular, cyclical, with a core is represented by what is shown here, which is a chakra. Chakra in the other Indo-Aryan languages Indo-European languages are symbolized by the circle, kirkul, chirka, whatever it is, circle, and that's also in the center of our Indian flag. So that brings us to the connection between the concepts created with the use of the language Sanskrit to represent creation. So coming to the world of physics today, I'm going to talk about how the language connects to the modern world of physics. So with the origin of the language having arisen from the need by these early astronomers and philosophers to formally record their observations and their understanding of nature of existence, to what is now an ongoing process of discovery, in a way, a validation of the Vedas. And I explained what the Vedas were. They were these compositions encompassing the knowledge, the insights, the Vedas, the insights gained. A dear friend of mine based in the US, amongst others, are exploring the truths found in these scripts, the Vedas, written in this language that the ancient philosophers had created. And I'd like to quote from some modern physicists, actually. Sorry, am I being heard? So Sir Arthur Eddington, who's an English astronomer, and I've got his book, which belonged to my mother. It's in tatters. It was published in 1929. Had a different interpretation to Einstein on relativity, but Einstein's theory of relativity also comes from the Vedas. So I'm just going to quote from a few modern scientists. Fritjof Capra, in his Uncommon Wisdom in 1899, said, in 1929, Heisenberg spent time in India. Heisenberg is a physicist as well, and began to see that recognition of relativity and the importance and impermanence and fundamental aspects of physical reality, which had been so difficult for him and his fellow physicists to grasp, was at the very basis of Indian spiritual tradition. Robert Oppenheimer, the access to the Vedas is the greatest privilege this century may claim to all previous centuries. Both Heisenberg and Oppenheimer studied Sanskrit to be able to read the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas in the original language. Niels Bohr, I go into the Upanishads to ask questions. Erwin Schrödinger in Meine Weltansicht, my view of the world. This life that we are living is not just a piece of the entire existence, but in a certain sense, the whole. Tat Tvam Asi, that which is you, I am. I am the east, the west, above and below. I am the entire world. Or in other words, what is now known as quantum physics. Nikola Tesla, from the 1944 biography by John O'Neill. All perceptible matter comes from a primary substance or tenuity beyond conception, filling all space, the Akash, or luminous ether, which is acted upon by the life-giving prana, or life force, calling into existence never-ending cycles of all things and phenomena. So, I mean, there are some more modern scholars. I'll just quickly read through. T. Bara, I've put on the table a book by T. Bara on Sanskrit, and quoting him, on account of its, he's a philologist studying languages. On account of its antiquity and well-preserved structure, Sanskrit is of unique importance to the study of Indo-European philology. Other names I came across of recent scholars of note in the field includes that of Brugmann, his book Grundriss der vergleichende Grammatik der Indo-Germanischen Sprache. He was born in 1886, in which he establishes the origin of Indo-European languages as being from the Aryan settlers on the Himalayas. So, and last but not least, the philologist Max Müller, who had made England his home, of his understanding of the commonality of the Indo-European languages, which owed their origin to Sanskrit. I've got some more connections here. So the Enlightenment can be traced to have been from several scholars being inspired to make revolutionary contributions to modern existence, building on the concepts embodied in the Vedas. The connection between energy and matter and the transmutation of one state to another, quantum physics. Of course, amongst them are Oppenheimer, Heisenberg, Dirac, Fermi, Niels Bohr, and Oppenheimer, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein, enormous numbers. And philosophers down the ages are Pythagoras, as I talked about, in the 3rd century BC, when after Alexander had failed to conquer India, but that opened the door for philosophers from Greece to actually come and spend time in India. And of course, the maths that Pythagoras took away is familiar to us today. 9th to 12th century, mathematics come to the West. This is not BC, but AD, 9th to 12th AD. Mathematics comes to the West via Persian Al-Khwarizmi and the Ottoman Empire Arabic translations. 14th to 16th centuries, Europe, Spinoza, Flanders, Italians, and Germans. I can elaborate on these during the question and answers. 17th to 19th century, the Enlightenment from translations commissioned by the British, translations of the Vedas, I mean, from Sanskrit, by the British East India Company. Max Müller, who worked for the East India Company on projects established from his translations that North Indian European languages came from the same family. So Vedas in the modern world, I think I've already talked about this, haven't I? Beginnings of mathematics and physics. We have traced the development of modern mathematics as we know it today from the origins in from ancient India, from the ancient text, the Vedas. So I shall not elaborate anymore, but I shall take you quickly through, it's a bit of a summary of matter, energy, and gravity. The material world or form, in Sanskrit, prakriti or nature, of Purusha, nature of Purusha. Purusha is actually understood to be the term for male, but it isn't the male, it's the creation. So essence or essential force or energy was seen to be part of a cycle of creation, destruction, and balance, the trinity of forces. And that it was particles of energy spinning around the center, as were all the celestial bodies that form was made of. Each anu, or atom in today's language, was in turn made up of subparticles and eventually of the paramanu, or the ultimate small particle, which was a quantum of energy, all being held together by a force, personified by Brahma, the creator, which was at the core of all existence. The concept of these cosmic cycles is central to the philosophy of the Vedas, and hence the word chakra, wheel or cycle, to describe it. The above forms the basis of what is studied as physics today, starting with the shunya. So shunya would have been before form or existence, a state can that be approached but never quite reached. The circle representing the whole concept of existence and nothingness, all there at the same time, there and not there, as I mentioned before, when Krishna said to Arjuna, you haven't killed these people, I have. They're there and not there at the same time. And so all perceptible material form would seem to be ephemeral, illusion or maya, and to be ultimately a collection of much smaller entities, energy. So Sanskrit connecting with the world today. Oopsie, sorry. So we can see with the spread of yoga in the modern world, when I started doing yoga in this country in 2000, there was just one class and there were five of us. Now there are 3 classes every day in the club that I belong to, all to do with yoga, and you have to book in advance because otherwise you're on the waiting list. So there's a huge demand for yoga, which comes out of yoga. Basically in Sanskrit means uniting. It's uniting the energy which we are made of with our physical form. So awareness, creating an awareness of through our material organs of perception of the spirit within. So that's uniting matter and energy. Awakening and awareness of the spirit, sound and silence. And Ayurveda is the Veda that studies living organic matter. And of course, the latest space research, which the Webb telescope has been using to confirm the concepts of the galaxies mentioned in the Vedas. And of course, the depicted in concept of energy creation and destruction. And that is also represented by the third form of the Holy Trinity in Vedic philosophy. Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiv, the destroyer. Because when he does the dance of destruction, it brings back into balance what Vishnu needs for preservation. So that is depicted in the statue on the right, which is Nataraja, the Lord of Dance, in the circle of fire, symbolizing creation, existence, and energy. And that's at the entrance of CERN in Switzerland, because CERN is they're investigating the paramanu, the ultimate small particle, which I don't know if they've found it yet. Have they? I don't know. So I'm just going to quickly take you through Sanskrit down the ages and how it has been passed down. Because as I said at the very beginning, it's a formal language which is very precise, and it was created to record the exact meanings of things. So Shruti and Smriti. Shruti is remembrance, hearing. Sorry, Shruti is using your, what sense is it? Oral perception. And Smriti is remembrance. So 6th millennium BC is when the settlers started to descend from the mountains, and they were using this method of remembrance and hearing and remembering. And it was the age of the Ramayana. Rama was the form of the avatar of Vishnu. That was the king, the king that was represented in the epic that was created. So when script was invented in the 6th millennium BC, it was the second era of where the society was becoming much more complex, and there were sort of issues of political, rivalries and, destruction. And so that was the era of the Mahabharata. That was 6th millennium onwards. And the Vedas, which were then scripted, were then different forms of Veda emerged, which I will talk about now. Upanishads, Puranas, Vedangas, and the epics, and I will tell you what they are. So the dissemination of the knowledge was originally shlokas, which in modern slogan, if you like, previously chanted and now recorded in the form of the Vedas. This knowledge, as I said, was chanted previously, and that happened up to the 6th century BC when it was written. And what happened subsequent to that is that, I'll talk about, can we move to the slide about the custodians of the Vedas? The next one. So what happened is when the Vedas were scripted, the people who had devoted, who were a section of society designated as Brahmins, were preserving and passing the knowledge of the existence the knowledge of existence and its origin as being from Brahma. They were actually a group of devoted people whose, a section of society whose entire job was to actually memorize these shlokas or chants and repeat them for the next generation of observers, who then, built on what they heard and their new observations to create more chants. So it was a full-time activity. That's all they ever did. And when script came in, they didn't have to memorize anymore, but they considered themselves to be the custodians of this knowledge, and they became quite possessive about it. So that brings us into that era of 1500 BC, where societies sort of, in a way, dominated by these custodians of the Vedas. And then society then developed other sections which was built on the strengths of the people. So Kshatriyas basically were the strong-armed people. So they were literally arms bearers and protectors, and they became the rulers. And Vaishyas are people, Vishnu is the earth. So Vaishyas are the people who mingled. There was no social distinction. They mingled with people because they obtained the means of survival, through trade and other things. And then, of course, there were the people who used their limbs, cultivators and so on and so forth. So they were, a large number of people. So the preservation, can we move on to the slide? Yeah. So the preservation of the Vedas became an issue because the custodians were quite possessive about what they were doing, which is what brings me to that previous slide on, oopsie, which one was it? on Sanskrit down the ages. So on the left-hand side, I think it's slide 40. Slide 40. Yeah. So on the left-hand side, I've mentioned the different, how Vedas evolved. So what happened was 1500 BC onwards, towards modern times, which is 2000, which is 1000 BC and 500 BC and 300 BC when Alexander, tried to get into India. The Vedas were then being sort of simplified by a group of people who then added their own contribution and interpretation, and those were known as Upanishads, Puranas, and Vedangas. Vedangas are basically Veda, angles of the Veda, or what do you call them? Limbs, and the epics, which were used to teach people. So the Vedas are actually, we come to slide 42 now. The Vedas are a collection of texts in 4 fundamental collections: the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Jajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. These are defined as a store of wisdom of the Aryans, who are speakers of the Sanskrit language, the people who settle in the Himalayan region around the 20th century BC. These are hymns, poems, mantras, and mythological tales written in Vedic Sanskrit. Despite being the oldest texts of mankind, they connect with modern physics and mathematics, as I've talked about. The oldest is the Rig Veda, the Rig Veda Samahita, the first Veda to be composed. So I think we can move on to slide 44. So as I was saying, the preservation and prevalence of Sanskrit over the millennia became a bit of an issue, and so society underwent a bit of a revolution when these Vedangas came in, and people in all the different sections of society had access to the knowledge. So that brings us to the 3rd millennium BC, to 1500 BC, the era of Mahabharata, where life was very complex, politics was complex, human relations were complex, and the Vedangas came into being. So the tutorials known to the West through the Vedanga, through some names that I'll mention. Panini was a grammarian, and mathematical concepts of the zero were also further developed and passed on. So I'm now coming to post-1500 BC to modern times, and that's when the Sanskrit language developed other forms. So the Vedangas were sort of disseminated through rishis and mathematicians. Rishis are basically scholars, if you like, and the mathematicians. And the spread of Buddhism east and south of India was through languages like Pali, which originated from Sanskrit, but incorporated the basic sounds that were in use by the indigenous peoples. And then the Ashokan Empire, which covered a large section of the Asian continent, and the Mauryan Empire, there's evidence today of Sanskrit being spoken in what is known as the East Indies. So Thailand, Malaysia, all the way up to, and then the other belt kicks in, which is the Aramaic belt. So Tamil and Illai and all that goes up to Korea, that belt which curves up. So in more modern times, 5th century BC onwards, I've spoken about the role of the Vedangas, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans were also, actually, yeah, I'll come to that in a minute. And the development of Pali as a transmitter of the ideas of Buddha, and the modern North Indian languages then developed from Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindi, Gujarati, and Marathi. These are the states in northern England, northern India, sorry. Oh, slide 48. Are we on slide 48? Okay. No, but what about, can we go back to 48? Oh, I think, no, we don't need that. Yeah, okay. So we come from, which era were we in? Oopsie. We've talked about modern times to 5th century to the CE and the present day. So the Greeks, Max Muller had established North Indian languages and the European languages of the Aryan belt came from the same family, and I explained why the term Aryan developed. It was the Europeans, came across the term Arya, speakers of the Sanskrit language, and hence the Aryan belt. And translations from the Sanskrit were archived in monasteries in Spain and Portugal because the history of that is that Italy, as it was getting in the Ottoman Empire, it had a very long, a very lengthy coastline and were very involved in trade. And their trade was growing, so they needed a system of numbers to evaluate the wealth created by all the trade. And the Roman numerals were not very helpful in recording large numbers. So Fibonacci, who was the son of an Italian trader, actually came across the translation from the Vedas by this gentleman called, a Persian gentleman called Al-Khwarizmi, who translated for the benefit of the Ottoman Empire from the Sanskrit into Arabic. And it came to be known as the Arabic numbers in the West subsequently, but they hadn't actually cottoned on to the use of the zero and the number and the 10 powers of 10 to enable them to measure really large numbers. That was actually cracked by a chap called Fibonacci, the son of an Italian trader. And so the concept was actually brought into Italy, but translations into Latin were then cleverly archived by the Catholic Church, because the Catholics didn't want the concept of the zero and the questioning of the geocentric form of existence, as was then known, to be questioned. So these Latin translations were actually archived until in the 17th century, Flanders became home to all the refugees from Portugal and Spain and so on, people who had originated from, the Jewish population, because they had a sort of the Jewish people had a sort of what shall I say, an open-minded quest for knowledge, and Spinoza was one of them. When he came as a refugee to Flanders, that opened up the door for these translations from the Vedas to be read by the people in Germany and so on, and a lot of German scholars followed, on his footsteps, and the knowledge of the Vedas was therefore disseminated. So moving eastwards, here's a slide which shows travels of, I can't pronounce this, Fa Hien and Xuanzang, who was a Chinese scholar, and he had, of course, got wind here because of Buddhism, which evolved from why Buddhism isn't practiced in India vastly is because to be a Hindu is a European term. There's no such thing. To be an Indian with a lineage, which relates you to the astronomers and philosophers who settle in the Himalayan range, you basically, Vedas are your books of knowledge. So your books of knowledge are what you go by, and what you deduce from that is your own personal deduction. So you can't actually depend on someone else's interpretation of the Vedas, of the knowledge, and hang on to that. Therefore, Buddha, what he was doing is he was actually explaining the Vedas to the peasantry and others, and that didn't work well in the Indian system. But because after his death, the knowledge that he was bringing to the local people became very popular all over what is now known as the East Indies, and went to China, Japan, and all of that area. This scholar, Xuan Zhang, came all the way over the mountains of the land route, very difficult, challenging journey. And he came to Nalanda and to learn about, the concepts and the Vedas. So it traveled east, and then it traveled west. I've gone through how it went to the west, and I've gone through how it went to the east. So I've got a lot more slides, which are quite interesting, but I think I'll deal with those in the question and answers, because we don't want to overrun the time. But I would like to close. Is there another slide coming up? Oh, but what about the, can you go back to the one before? Enlightenment. Oh, I think, have I talked about that? Oh, so the final word I'll quote again from, this time from Mark Twain. He said in his 1897 work, Following the Equator After a World Trip, India is the cradle of the human race, the birth of human speech, the mother of history, the grandmother of legend, and the great-grandmother of tradition. Our most valuable materials in the history of man are treasured up in India only. Thank you very much. And I can go into more interesting things if there are any questions.
Do you have any questions?
Yes, just one. Thank you, Polly. That was a lovely lecture.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you.
I'm surprised, unless I missed it, I did actually notice. But did you mention Aryabhata or Brahma?
I haven't done, no.
Is there any comment made on the
Yes.
past?
Yeah. A 1,000 years before. Before what? Oh, yes, I have talked about that, but in summary, because as I was explaining, the Vedas are actually philosophical descriptions of the concept of existence. And it was a philosophy which was not very sort of comprehensible to people at large who were engaged in day-to-day activities, buying and selling, or protecting the society, strong-armed people protecting the society, looking after the land, or people engaged in trade and actually making things and producing food. So what happened is, from the 15th century onwards, up to the CE era, the Vedangas evolved, the Upanishads and the Vedangas. Vedas are the recordings of the insights, and Angas are angles, or what do you call them, limbs. And these Vedangas were written by tutorial. They were like tutorials written by tutors who were Brahmagupta and the others, their function was to make these Vedas, concepts in the Vedas, understandable to people. And also in their interpretation, they created formats which are in use today, like, for instance, the quadratic equations and so on and so forth. They're the works of these tutors in that era. That era is quite a vast era. It goes all the way from 5th century BC to the CE. So these people you're talking about, Brahmagupta, etc., they were in the CE era, AD. Does that help? Thank you. going to go on with some of the other interesting things. So 18th century, because I stopped in the CE era, 18th century Europe and England. So this is an era of romantics in India, and the map shows you. The map shows you the route taken by the East India Company in their the naval routes. But what was happening is that in this era, a lot of interest was, there was a lot of interest in Sanskrit by people who we know of, like Shelley, for instance. He had a cousin called Thomas Medwin, and Medwin had spent a lot of time in India, in the army, and he just got drawn in by the philosophy of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who's actually incidentally buried in Bristol, because he visited England, and he was mobbed in a way because he had empowered women in the 19th century, in the early 1800s, with his reforms. And in a way, he pioneered the suffragette movement here. But anyway, Medwin, cousin of Shelley, was quite taken by his philosophy, and he delved into Sanskrit in a big way. And this is reflected in the words in the works of Shelley. Have any of you read a lot of Shelley? No? Shelley the poet? Well, if you read his Alastor, it's set in Kashmir, and he brings in the bemused poet's search for the secrets of truths of the universe. So basically, he's actually interpreting the Vedas in his great composition, the Alastor. And then in his work, the Adonis, has anybody read that? He projects the idea of the one and the many in a forceful manner. The one remains, the many change and pass. So it's the concept of the energy transmuting. So I also, then the era of the East India, other connections. So as I had mentioned, we can go to, the other connections, So as I had mentioned before, 9th century, Portugal, Spain, and Flanders, they had, in Portugal and Spain, the archived translations from Arabic into Latin were discovered and brought to Flanders, and that led to a lot of discoveries, a lot of interest in Sanskrit Vedas by the German scholars, who then wanted to identify with the Sanskrit speakers, so they call themselves the Aryans. That was a term that was invented in Europe, the term Aryan. And because they were fascinated by the concepts, which actually took you into understanding existence in a way that hadn't been talked about before. So then I move on to the era of the East India Company. As I explained, my knowledge of Sanskrit and the translations are very recent, because I came across these translations here in England because I volunteer for the National Trust. And a lot of the properties of the National Trust are actually built by people who were involved with the East India Company, because in the 18th centuries, when there was a surge of neo-aristocrats who made their money through trade and other things, and they have in their libraries these translations, which were commissioned by the East India Company by Sanskrit scholars. And I want to quote an Oriental scholar and philologist called William Jones, who has a connection with Bath, by the way, who had learned Sanskrit and was able to translate for the East India Company from the Sanskrit Vedas. The East India Company, upon their discovering the Indian accounting system in Bengal, which they adopted and is what is used in the world today, had commissioned translations of the Vedas to gain insights into the source of the mathematical knowledge that they had come across in Bengal. And that is what led to the translations. So quoting from this scholar, Max Muller, in his 1786 address, sorry, not Max Muller, I'm talking about William Jones. He founded the Royal Asiatic Society based in Kolkata, which is in Bengal, where my forefathers are from. He said, the Sanskrit language is more perfect than Greek, more copious than Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both stronger affinity than could possibly have been produced by accident. No philologer could examine them without believing them to have sprung from a common source. A similar, but not quite so forcible, a reason for supposing that Gothic and Celtic had the same origin, though blended with different idiom, and Old Persian can be added to the same family. And we shall see later, this is from an earlier slide, these translations had brought the knowledge of the Vedas to England, contributing largely to the Enlightenment movement and to the Industrial Revolution. So then we go into the Vedic concept of matter, which I've talked about. I shan't repeat myself. Appendix 1, shall we go to, oh, are there any questions on the chat?
No questions on the chat.
Oh.
One there.
Oh.
Somebody.
Yes, Raja Ram Mohan Roy.
Hello.
Has he been answered? Right.
Yes, my question. I've done a little bit of work in ancient geometry, starting with Pythagoras and actually going back much further, Stonehenge and the pyramids. And I'm wondering why the Egyptians are not included anywhere in your coverage. Is there a reason for that?
Thanks for the question. There is no reason. I just thought there's so much to cover and there's a time limit, so I didn't go into it, but you're quite right. Back in the 1500 period that I talked about, when there was an evolution in terms of, in the era of Rama, in the evolutionary scale, that's when I think there was a contact with Egypt, because in the records in the scripts that are maintained in ancient households in Bengal, there is a record of scholars having come via the land route from Egypt to study astronomy. And that predates the building of the pyramids, which, if you study the way they're built, they're based on concepts of astronomy. So yes, there is a connection. Thank you very much. And it's recorded. There's a written record of visits by Egyptian scholars to India via the land route. Any other questions? Because there's some interesting slides.
We must stop at 9 o'clock, so we've got to.
Shall we show them Appendix 1 and 2? There's just Appendix 1 is Nalanda University, which was built in the CE, 1200, in the 5th century BC, sorry. I don't know why I've written C here, that's a mistake. It was a center of learning for Buddhists, because Buddha was born where Rama was depicted to have been born, in the foothills of the Himalayan region in what is now known as Bihar, which is, and there is this university which was actually destroyed by the Muslim invaders. And that goes back a long time. And then the slide that follows is an interesting mixture of things, which shows you a telescope in a 12th century temple carving, because the temples in India are intricately carved with very exquisite and intricate figures depicting different things that they're doing. And one of them depicts this lady on the right holding a telescope, and that goes back to 12th century. And there are places in India which have natural telescopes built, in such a way that the angles at which the shadow falls actually coincides with so many concepts, with the movements of the astral bodies. It's very interesting. And at the bottom, I have this Bodhyana Subhasutra, which is a Sanskrit. It's so small I can't read it, but it's basically the Pythagoras theorem, which is in one of the Vedas. The written Vedas were written in 6000 BC. And on the right, there's another thing about something from the Upanishads. Upanishads were again created. Upa means up, above, Nishad. So it's sort of like a summary of the knowledge of the Vedas, which is very difficult because the Vedas run into millions of texts, millions of scrolls. And even in the modern world, they're the largest number of scripted scrolls in existence. So the Mundak Upanishad. Mundak is earth. I mean, Mund, I think the French word Mundak Upanishad, written around 6000 BC in ancient India, is associated with Atharva Veda. It describes, I'm sorry, the English is not correct. It describes tachyons, particles that travel faster than light, ultraviolet band, infrared, nuclear energy, and black holes in the space. I mean, these are just, because the Upanishads were sort of derivatives of the Vedas. So all the knowledge was actually in the Vedas already, but as I was explaining, there had to be tutorials to make them more understood by the people at large. And below that is Pascal's triangle, which was based on the Meru Prastara, derived from Pingala's formula. So I think Tony is familiar with Pingala. And below that, I thought you might be interested in seeing some Sanskrit script. So it's a picture of something from Sanskrit. Then we don't need to go into 3 because I've talked about the, and then the Gupta period. I think somebody asked a question about, I can't remember. Did somebody ask me about Gupta period? Well, that is 300 AD to 500 AD, and Harshavardhan was another king, and they were very, the Gupta period brought into contact India with a vast area of Asian continent and the, east of India.
Anyway, I think it's 9 o'clock now. I think that was quite a journey we've been on, I think, and it's quite extraordinary how much they knew or how much we're still discovering, that how, it is quite amazing how enlightened they were, and we're still learning a lot from these ancient people. So thank you
They
very
took a few thousand years to actually come to those deductions, but they were aided by the Vedas, which were recording their observations as they went along.
Well, that's quite, as I say, thank you very much, Deepali. That was, it'll take a lot of time to work it out, but I shall try and sort of study these things now, because I think there's a lot there we need to sort of think about. And but it's a wonderful, wonderful introduction to Sanskrit and all it entails, not just the language, but the astronomy and the astrology and the religion. And from what you're saying, all our languages derive from it. So
well, the Indo-European belt, but as I was saying, there are different belts based on sounds that were created, but not all the
thank you very much. That was quite an effort.